Good morning. My name is Ashley Butler, and today I will be presenting and defending my senior thesis. My senior thesis statement is, Christian filmmakers need to focus more on creating quality films. Thank you. It has been said, cinema is not only about making people dream, it's about changing things and making people think. Cinema is one of the most powerful and effective tools used to display ideas and agendas. However, many Christian films have lost their power and effectiveness. The sad truth is, the majority of Christian films are lacking in the necessary qualities that are needed to create engaging and impactful entertainment. To solve this, Christian filmmakers need to focus more on creating quality films. But first, let's address the elephant in the room. How can we as Christians even be in the entertainment industry? Well, some think it's impossible, but essentially it's the same as any other workplace. God calls us to be a light to every tribe, tongue, and nation, and that's the same as the entertainment industry. Cinema should be seen as a mission field, and Christians should enter it as innocent as doves and as shrewd as snakes. Christians need to create art, because in the film world, that is the only way to bring light to such a dark place. So what is quality in cinema? Well, Gabby Grigstar, in the article it says, What Makes a Movie Entertaining, says this. When the cinematography, editing, writing, sound, music, acting, and direction all come together, the film has potential to be great. And all of these elements are vital, but there's still a major aspect missing, and that's the theme. The theme determines why the story should be told. It is the overarching message of the film, and the story is born out of it. But when considering theme, one must also consider plot, because theme without plot is one of the main reasons that films fail today. So where do many Christian films fail today? Well, surprisingly enough, it starts with the audience. The Christian audience as a whole doesn't care about good plot or acting. They only seem to care about the message of the film. If it teaches this beautiful Christian life with a satisfying ending and is free of all inappropriate content, then they are satisfied. They are satisfied to accept mediocre art if it fits their worldview. The audience is not the only problem, however. Most Christian films worry more about the message rather than the quality of the film itself. They worry more about the theme, and they don't worry about the plot. Christian filmmakers need to focus more on creating quality films. Christian films should no longer be accepted just because they are Christian. They need to be weighed next to every other film in Hollywood and be found on par or better because of good story and acting. I believe that as Christian filmmakers, we need to start creating content that is wholesome, but has a good, strong messages that brings in the secular audience. Films that have subtle Christian messages that the audience won't turn them off, and they will listen, and they will start to think. But how can we, as the general public, make a change? If we are not filmmakers or artists, how can we still make a difference? Well, my call to action is this. First of all, don't be a duty-driven audience member. Don't go watch a film just because it is labeled Christian. Start watching films that maybe are not labeled Christian but have redeeming messages and bring hopeful views to the world. Because if the industry sees that these are the films that people are watching, they will create more of them. And lastly, start having conversations about the films you see. Ask yourself, what was the theme? Did the theme speak truth? What does it mean with my worldview? Put yourselves in the shoes of the character, of the villain. Would you have done the same thing? Would you have done it differently? And to conclude, storytellers need to start creating stories that are wholesome, but raw and engaging. They need to step up as Christians and stop trying to divide the entertainment industry in two. They need to use the devil's tactics against himself and sneak into the entertainment industry with our good and innocent stories. But these stories have to make people think. They need to question, because when they start to question, they start to find themselves at the cross. Thank you very much. I'm ready for my questioning.
I don't see it. Oh, right here. Ashley, congratulations.
Thank you.
This was such an inspiring and thought-producing reading for me. And so I just feel like you gave a fantastic synopsis of
the information that you shared in your thesis. I wanted to tell you that I appreciated your use of the strong quote at the beginning, and in using that, you really came full circle at the end, saying that cinema is about changing things and making people think. You really did bring that all to the end of your paper when you repeatedly called for us to think and called for the importance of cinema's role in making people think. And in that, to have an opportunity for cinema to bring about ultimate change in Christ. And so you really just honed that in at the end, and you really made it clear that film is really an optimal art form for this purpose. And so this really helped me to see your argument throughout about how impactful film can be for the Christian audience and for the gospel. So, great.
Thank you.
I'll second those things. There was a lot of emotion and conviction that really came throughout the whole paper. I never felt like you wavered. I appreciate you choosing this topic. I feel like it was a difficult topic. There's such a great need to take a Christ-like worldview into all corners of culture, and I was excited to see your take on it.
Thank you.
And I appreciate it because art is so subjective. We say we like it or we don't. And I noted page 7 of your paper, you actually really broke down the subjective versus objective view of saying, okay, there's certain things we can say we like or we don't like, but let's look at these elements, or at least use those for quality and helping define what is plot versus what is theme, because we often don't separate it as an audience. So you helped us get an inside look into that.
Thank you.
So I was able to read this really personally. I am probably that duty-driven audience member just because of my personality, just rule follower, duty-driven in some nature, but my husband is the opposite. And so to read this and kind of hone in on what can those non-relative things be as we're going and supporting movies, I guess I really was driven to think there are specifics, there are a standard that we can look for. And so I really appreciate you calling out the difference in a lasting impact and a fleeting feeling. I thought those were great thought-provoking things you brought out.
Thank you. And I think that to add on to your point about a lasting impact and a fleeting feeling, that with cinema, I feel like we often go because we want to be entertained, of course. We want to almost escape the world. But subconsciously, we watch films and they get into our mind and we're thinking about them, we're thinking about the story. And so you always need to be careful about what you're putting in. But you also need to see films and be able to discern what is truth, what is not truth, how does it fit with your worldview. And I feel like often as Christians, we can shove aside certain films because they may not fit our worldview. But to watch them and realize that there is truth in them and there's not. Of course, I understand that there's a line for everyone and what they will and what see. And I'm not saying that everyone should go every single film because we are all different. And I don't recommend watching every film 100% not, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we need to be able to use discernment, but we also can't be so cautious that we exclude art, because I feel like all art, regardless of who creates it, displays God's glory, because we are all created in His image. Either it shows the downfall and the sin of human nature, or it glorifies Him. And I think we need to look for the redeeming parts in every single story. And that's something that my mentor and my theater teacher actually taught me a lot. In acting and just looking at the best redeeming qualities and how it fits with our worldview and how it fits with truth.
Thank you. In your essay, you said, cinema should be seen as a mission field, and Christians should enter it being innocent as doves and shrewd as snakes. I was curious, as you were doing your research, a way to sneak into this secular audience. Did you come up with any ideas or maybe social issues that you felt like that you would start with as you kind of bridged and tried to reach that audience, the more challenging audience?
So from a Christian worldview and reaching the secular audience? Yes. So I think that it needs to be, I don't know if any of you have seen some of these Christian films, but have any of you seen the Jesus Revolution? I know that's very controversial in film. Some people don't, some people like it. So that is, I'm going to use it as an example. It clearly has Jesus in the title, and it is an amazing film. And I think it shows Christianity in a very raw way, what I was saying in my paper. So I think we need to make films like that because they reach Christians, but they also reach the secular audience. But then to add on to that, I feel like there are many secular people that would not go see it purely because it has the name Jesus Revolution. And so I think we need to also start, I think there's two camps. You have the Christian filmmakers that are creating for the Christian audience, and then you have the Christian filmmakers that are creating for the secular audience. And so when you're creating for the Christian audience, you have to know who your audience is. And so you're going to include maybe more, this doesn't mean that the quality should lessen in any way, or the message should lessen. It shouldn't be cheesy in any way. But it needs to be real, but you can have the more Bible verses and the more Christian feeling. Like, it should never feel like a sermon. That's another thing. Never a sermon, but it needs to be a story. But then when you have a secular audience, I feel like you just need to have redeeming messages. And I think of like Narnia, and I think of Lord of the Rings, stories like that are not overtly Christian, that you wouldn't think of that are Christian. We Christians can see the truth in those stories, but they're not saying that Jesus, they're not like using a scripture verse every other sentence, and they're not like talking about all these like, it's not in a church. These are stories that have good storylines, that are solid, that are redeeming, uplifting, with good qualities, but are still, the secular audience is drawn to those. So that's how I feel like we can bring in that secular, I know it's a very roundabout way to answer your question, how we can bring in that secular audience. So we need to start creating films that they will watch, but also have redeeming Christian messages that they won't even notice that they're watching. They'll watch it, and then they'll think about that later, and then they'll be like, why did that person act that way? Why was it? They'll feel something different when they watch these films, and there will be something different. Like when we watch Lord of the Rings and Narnia, and stories like that are Christian, but they're not, you wouldn't know they were Christian unless you were in fact one. So I think we need to start creating stories like that, and writing them, and actors, I think if you were a film actor, you need to start promoting the Lord, but you also just need to be a light on every set. I think you need to go, and you need to be able to go on secular sets. Of course, don't draw a line of what you're able to do on camera, but be a light to everyone. When you're on those sets, you have to be, no matter what position you are, crew, cast, you need to show God's love to everyone, not in a way that's like preaching, but in a way that's like genuine. Just be kind to them, be nice, because often on sets, people are so stressed out that if you're just nice to them, they'll be like, what are they doing? Why are they nice? And that will start to ask questions. So I think it's all about having that initial relationship and those initial stories that ask the right questions.
I have a crazy question. Why did you title this paper Striking?
Okay, so on set, the term striking means that they are turning on the lights. So you have to look away or you will literally be blinded. And so I feel like I want to title this paper Striking because for some people in the audience, or maybe just for me myself, when I first thought about this, it was striking for me. I almost had to turn away. Like it felt like the lights were turning on for the very first time. And thinking about art and thinking about cinema and using it as a way to glorify the Lord. And so I really wanted to turn on the lights into almost a dark place, as in the entertainment industry can be a very dark place. So I would ask Christians to strike and turn on those lights, but then also as Christians in our own lives to strike and turn the lights and to wake up and realize that we can use cinema to glorify the Lord and it's not necessarily an evil tool. And cinema is just cinema, and it's how we use it that makes it good or evil.
You mentioned early on the elephant in the room of how and can Christians, or should they be, in the film industry. So when it comes to being a Christian in the film industry, what is your most compelling argument against that?
That's good. So I think it depends on the Christian. It depends on the individual. I feel like we are all made differently. We're all created differently, and that's how the Lord wants us to be. Some of us can handle certain things, and some of us can't. And so my most compelling argument for not entering the film world is know your boundaries. If you feel like you will be tempted or you will not be able to stand your ground, if you feel like when you're in a secular environment, you start to adapt and become more like that secular environment, then do not tempt yourself. Don't enter an industry that you know that will hurt you in the end. Because, I mean, you hear all the horror stories of Taylor Swift or just these Christian people that go and enter the entertainment industry and then they fall away from the Lord. And so if you feel like you are not strong enough, do not tempt yourself. Or if you feel like you want to start and enter this industry, I would start with the Christian film world. So you know, I was in film class once, and my teacher, he made me say, like, write out a whole list of things I'm willing to say or not say or do or not do on camera. So I have that list since I've been a junior in high school. So even when 20 years, 30 years from now, I can look at that list and be like, I will not do this. I said I wouldn't, I will not compromise. So you need to not be able to compromise. And if you feel like you're a person that you're still working on your faith, or you can be tempted and you will compromise, do not tempt yourself. Do not put yourself in that situation because you will fall away and that won't be good. But I do feel like we're all working on our faith every single day. And so that's saying if you feel like you wouldn't be able to do it now, but you can do it in the future for sure. And if you feel like the Lord is calling you, then you gotta go and you gotta trust that He will lead you and guide you and lean on Him in everything you do. And so I'm not discerning anyone. I'm not saying anyone is not strong enough because I think with the Lord we are all strong enough to be in that industry. But I do think the Lord calls us to do different things and He's made us differently. So use discernment for our own lives, but I think pray, think about it. But it's a fun industry, so yes.
You touched on quality of the Christian films, and I was curious, what do you feel like has led to the lack of quality most significantly? Is it budget? Is it the audience that I believe you said, a duty-driven audience? What do you think contributes the most to the shortcomings of cinema in the Christian film industry?
Yes. So in my paper I said duty-driven audience, which I discussed a little bit, but it's mostly I'll go and watch the film just because it is labeled Christian. So I think that the duty-driven audience, when I was researching, that was the biggest thing that came up, which surprised me the most because you would normally think it was the budget or something else, which it depends on the film, it depends on who's making it. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening, but I'm going to keep talking anyway. So the budget definitely plays an aspect, but I also think you should never be hindered by a budget because I've seen films that have a very low budget and they are phenomenal and you would never believe it. So I think like the loaves and the fishes, the Lord can take whatever and use it. So don't let that hinder you. And I think it might be the audience, which surprised me the most because if you take a group of people and they are going to watch this film and they're always supporting it and they're not looking at the quality or the acting or the cinema shots and they are willing to accept this mediocre art form that they know they're watching it, it doesn't measure up to Hollywood. Like I talk to so many people and they're always like, yes, I watch Christian films, but I would rather be watching this, or this film is my favorite because this is so full of life and cinema. It's just beautiful on screen. And so I feel like we shouldn't accept Christian films just because they are Christian. That is not, so I think it's the audience member of just going to watch it and they don't say anything about it. Now I'm not saying we shouldn't watch these Christian films because we should support them because at least they're going out and making films. That's hard to do as Christians, but I think we can't just load on praises and be like, yes, you're doing amazing, this is phenomenal. And I feel like a lot of times if you look at Christian films, the IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, the rating will be low, but the audience rating is usually very high because the audience is just Christian. And so they're going to rate it very high. And they're not focused on the quality, they're focused on the message. And that's not to say the message is any less important, but it needs to be on the same scale. The message and the quality and the story need to be all on the same line. And so I feel like that duty-driven audience member is a very large problem. And you need to support these films, but you also need to be like, how can we make it better? Because we're doing the same old things, and these filmmakers and writers are all seeing that it's working, that they're making the money, so they're like, why would we change? Why would we change what we're doing? And we'd be like, no. I'm glad you're making these films, but we can constantly be making it better. Because this is an art form. This is how we glorify the Lord. And I read in a book, one of the books I quoted, Walking on Water, it needs to be your best for His highest because we are creating art for the Lord. This is our gift to Him. So our art form should be better than Hollywood's because they're just doing it for themselves. They're doing it for the money. We are doing it for the Lord. So it should be the very best that we can possibly give. So another very roundabout answer, but there you go. I think it's the duty-driven audience. And also just the lack to change, too.
If you could begin again and start this research, is there anything that you would change or focus on differently? I mean, obviously you've come up with like, oh, I found out more about the audience than I thought. But now, having gone through this, if you were to, say, do a thesis in college on it, where would you maybe change or alter your approach?
So I think I'd have a very clear line between the secular audience and the Christian audience because I feel like I didn't make that clear enough in my paper. As I said before, you need to be careful of what the films of the secular audience is more drawn to. They won't be drawn to films that are super full of scripture verses and preaching and all of that. And whereas the Christian audience will be able to watch it more. And I feel like sometimes you need to watch these films because they lift you up a little bit. So it needs to have those elements, definitely not in a way that's cheesy and not in a way that's, you're just watching it and you're like, he's just preaching a sermon. I can hear them preaching right now, because that's the difference between a sermon and a story. A story is supposed to ask questions and a sermon is supposed to provide the answers. So in a Christian story, always ask the questions. But regardless, I think I would very clearly write, I don't know, I would have another paragraph, another section. I almost want to divide my paper in two between your secular and Christian audiences. And I'm not saying those never mix, because they do mix, for sure. And I know that there's secular people that go watch Christian films and Christian people that watch secular films, because I know for sure. So I'm not saying they shouldn't mix, but I think I want to make that a tiny bit clearer in my paper, because I didn't the first time. I think that's what I would add a little bit.
Thank you.
I'd also love to research more about the filmmakers by doing it. Like I researched like the big ones, like the Irwin brothers and the Coen brothers, but just go up and interview and talk to actual filmmakers. If I had those tools, I would love to do that and go and ask them their opinions. And the Christian filmmakers that are making some of the Christian films that we might not think are the highest quality, I would love to like know what they're thinking, their actual thought process. I would love to do that too.
Toward the end of your paper, you do call out quality films, such as The Chosen and Jesus Revolution. Can you discuss whether or not you found it difficult to not call out the low quality films, and how did you hone in your focus for this?
That's a very good question. I did include some high quality films. I think I'm almost going to say I didn't want to offend anyone. I didn't want to be like, you guys are reading it. I love that film because I mentioned how I love God's Not Dead, and it makes me cry almost every single time I watch it. But I know, story-wise, and being in the film industry, it's not the highest quality film. The story is very lacking, and it's very a sermon and kind of cheesy, but I love it because it makes me cry, and then that's like that fleeting emotion that it makes me have, but I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else as a quality film. And so I think it's not like it's different. I think there's for sure a line. Like I said, there's certain things that there's quality and not quality. You can tell when you're watching. But I think when it comes to the more, maybe the cheesy messages, or the, not even cheesy, but the messages that are very out there, very open, some Christians really love that. And they love that. And they'd be like, well, I don't think that hinders the quality. I think that might not. And some Christians are very much, no, that's like bad quality. I think we need to focus more on how it's not. But I also think it was more of my opinion for some of the films, and it was less about the quality of the cinematography or the acting or even sometimes the writing. It was more my opinion when I watched it. I think they're just like forcing a sermon on me, which I don't think is how cinema should be done. I don't think it's how story should be done, but some people do. And so I didn't want to even open that can of worms. And I also didn't include any secular films because we also have a very clear line of what some people are okay watching and some people aren't. And so I don't think we need it. That's not what I'm discussing in my paper. And so I didn't even want to touch on it because that's not my power. I am not the Lord. So I can't say what's okay for some people and what's okay for other people.
Maybe to follow up on that, how do you personally balance the subjective and the quality that you want to see in figuring out how to support Christian films, secular films, those types of things?
So I have been to actually many Christian film conferences, and so at the conferences you see all types of films, and you're like, the quality there was not great, the writing and acting was very interesting, but you also know that you know how much time and work and effort goes into every single film, and so it's very hard for me to be very like, oh, just throw it out just because it was awful, like no one should ever watch it, because maybe someone should watch it, because there was a reason it was created. I believe that there's a reason every single film was created, because in the Lord's hands. And so, personally, I think that if I can clearly hear you preaching a message to me, I get turned off. I'm like, I don't want to sit here. I didn't come here for a sermon. I came here for a story. I came here to be drawn into the story. I came here to see the characters and the world that they're creating around them. And that's why I go and I love cinema so much, because I'm also an actress. And so I very much care about the character and what the character's thinking, and that's how I determine if a film is almost high quality or not, for just my personal. If the characters draw me in, if I'm drawn to their storyline, then I love it, which is not how everyone, I know that's not how everyone sees it. I know people look at the cinematography or the writing, and I look at that too, but mostly it's the character for me. Very personal.
After completing your research, do you lean more toward hopeful or discouraged when you think about Christian film?
I think definitely hopeful, because there was a time I was writing my paper and I was seeing all these films like The Jesus Revolution and The Chosen, and then these like very high quality films with good messages that I watched, and I didn't feel like they were preaching to me. And so I was like, oh, well, do I even need to write my paper? I feel like people are already starting to get this idea in their head. Like, I'm starting to see it. And so, very helpful. And there was a time where I was like, I kind of have to change half of this, because I'm like, we're now seeing this. Like, we're seeing it happen much more and more and more. It's slow and it's gradual, but it's happening in abundance, I feel like. And there's also, I feel like, more TV shows and more movies that are coming out that are redeeming messages that I've been seeing that are not necessarily full of all this garbage. And I feel like also with some more new films that are coming out, they're trying to push all these modern ideas and agendas, and people see that. Just like Christians sometimes push our agendas, the culture, and not the culture, but some of these other ideas that are infiltrating our culture right now, the filmmakers are pushing those, and people see that, and I feel like we see a draw on those films. So I feel like this is the perfect time for Christians to start creating their films that are good stories and are redeeming messages, because people, I think that's what they want. That's what they were used to in film. That's how cinema started out. And so they want to get back to that. They don't want a sermon. They don't want all these ideas pushed on them, because we as people know that. When we're watching subconsciously, we're like, something's wrong here. Someone's pushing an idea. And so we know that, and we want to push away from that. So I'm very, very hopeful. Very hopeful.
With that, would you say, I don't know, is there a percentage of, okay, people need to, the cinematographers, the filmmakers need to do better, or the audience needs to support films differently?
I think it's both. I think the audience needs to support films. They need to be brave enough to not always rate film super high because it was Christian, and they need to be brave enough to talk about films like I talked about in my abstract, and have a conversation about, why was that film low quality? What was the theme? Was it low quality? Did you like it? Did you not like it? And so having these conversations, they then need to be able to go and, I don't know, we have now social media, so we all have a platform to go and speak about it. And so we can speak about it, and we need to start influencing the filmmakers. We as the audience need to influence the filmmakers, because if they're like, we see that we're not making as much money, or the ratings aren't as high, they're like, why is it happening? And then they will in turn go and be like, ask the audience, like, what's happening? Why is this happening? And they will start to make a change. They will start to make a difference. So I think it starts with the audience. It starts with us, because we are the ones that see it, and oftentimes filmmakers, if we see that the money's rolling in, if we see that people like it, the ratings high, they're like, why would we change it? It's obviously working. We were like, no, it's not working as well as we thought it was working. We need to let them know, because oftentimes they cannot do that.
How did this process really spur you on or fuel you to make a difference from here on out?
I feel like it definitely made me want to speak about it more and to talk about it more, and also in my own life be like, okay, where am I accepting films just because, and not of the quality, just purely because I like watching them. And I'm not saying that's bad, but it makes me start to realize more and more, focus on what I'm watching, why am I watching it, what is the message behind everything I see, like what is this putting into my life? Is this helping me or is it hindering me? And I feel like it's definitely made me draw closer to the Lord, draw closer to the film industry, and appreciate it more, because it is such an art. And it made me realize how beautiful it is and how we can all use it for the Lord's glory. And so, I don't know, it just really helped me. It gave me hope, and it gave me just an excitement to do more for everything that I can in the industry. And I don't know how I can help from here, but I don't know, spread the word, everyone.
Yeah, I think your research in your paper really gives great parallels for just a Christian life in general. I mean, as we're looking at Christian films, so how does that encourage you as well?
I'm so sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I mean, really, how does what you have learned encourage you just in your Christian life in general, whether it's in film, or how can you encourage the audience in that today?
Yeah, I feel like what I've learned, it's helped me realize that everything we do, not just cinema, whether our work, our schoolwork, especially right now, we're doing it for the Lord's glory. And that was a big thing that I didn't talk about in my paper, but that really I thought about when I did my paper, because especially senior year, I've definitely done some assignments like half-heartedly, like shoved it under the rug and be like, this is okay, I'll just go up and talk about this. I mean, I've read some history chapters. So, just being working as hard as I can, doing everything I do, even if it seems small and it seems like it doesn't matter, we're doing it to glorify the Lord. And so cinema seems like this huge big thing. I'm like, I love acting and I can do that for the Lord. But how can I just go and drive Austin to basketball practice for the Lord? How can I just help around the house for the Lord? We hear about all the time, do everything to glorify the Lord, but then I never stop to actually think about it and be like, is what I'm doing actually glorifying the Lord? It's not. How I'm doing it in my heart is not glorifying the Lord. And so it made me stop and realize just to have excellence in everything I do and just also seek the Lord's glory in everything I do because I'm doing it for Him. And this art form, this tiny paper, this reading the history chapters, it's for the Lord. And so just doing that for Him and doing it with a happy heart has really been the biggest impact for me. Good morning. My name is Jane Fusco, and I will be presenting my senior thesis. My senior thesis statement is, the current culture's indoctrination of the American population is responsible for degradation and critical thinking. If you were of the world, then the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I've chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. John 15:19. This verse has become a staple of Christian life. And specifically talking about a Christian's involvement with the culture. An abbreviated form is often found and quoted on Christian blogs and media. In the world, but not of it, has been championed among many catchphrases representing the Christian walk of faith. However, as Christians, I believe that we're operating under a misunderstanding of that verse. The Lord did not intend for us to be separated from the culture or to be segregated into various sects and subcultures of Christianity, but instead to be lights within the broken world in which we live. Many Christians are not living in the world at all, but instead they are attempting to create their own worlds, safe from the controversy of the culture.
Modern culture has pervaded nearly every aspect of daily life. From the numerous social movements in the past few years, to social media outbursts and cancel culture, to even the state of our educational system, the influence of culture is clear. As humans, we're more often than not governed by societal pressure. Even as Christians, we're far more influenced by the culture than we realize. Division, separation, and unrest have been defining characteristics in the past 3 years of American history. Specifically, these facets of life have been spurred by several notable crises. The COVID-19 pandemic, riots, and other cases of civil unrest have created discordance within our country. Throughout this turbulent time, educational curricula, social media content, and social movements all have been centered around this idea of inclusion. This is a result of the new wave of cultural trends, such as the LGBTQ rights movement and cancel culture. From the surface, these ideas of inclusion, equal opportunity, and consideration for others all seem like attributes we should exhibit. But at their core, the ideologies the culture is promoting as truth are contrary to the Bible. Currently, one of the main ideologies of the culture is conflict avoidance. This principle has bled into our educational systems, social media platforms, and been the basis of numerous social movements. Avoidance of conflict is found in the educational system through the removal of challenging materials and a shift in the purpose of education itself. In social media, the concepts of censorship, herd mentalities, and influencers all follow the trend of inclusion and safety. Furthermore, because of this cultural ideology, of conflict avoidance and inclusion, the progressive Christian movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, and cancel culture have all utilized this idea of safetyism and inclusion, and are in turn creating a population of individuals that are unable to face adversity. The current culture's indoctrination of the American people is responsible for degradation in critical thinking. If the culture truly has pervaded all of these aspects of Christian life, then what should the Christian's response be? For many, ignoring the grip culture has on their children, their thoughts, and their personal lives is the route taken. Even more dangerously, many attempt to remove themselves from society in hopes of avoiding the influence of culture altogether. While this may seem like a beneficial means of protection against the ideologies of the culture, in reality, Christians are becoming ineffectual. Our ignorance and inability to connect the dots between the influence of the culture and our duty to change it make us no wiser than the society we ridicule. Casting stones from our glass houses, we judge others for not stepping out and fighting the ideologies of the culture, all the while we are content to stay in our bubbles of commonality. We need to remember that we have been called to live in the world, but to not be of it. Better said, we're called to be in the world, but to not become like it. Living in the world means being active and aware of cultural trends and ideologies so that we can equip ourselves with the knowledge that's necessary for us to be able to combat the falsehoods the culture is promoting as truth. We need to stop hiding in the comfort of our Christian communities and be willing to speak the truth in love to the broken world in which we live. If Christians want to see change, then they need to become proponents of change. I believe that Christians need to be active members of society and be the first to encourage critical thinking by not blindly accepting the ideologies of the culture. Whether it is by becoming a teacher in the public school, taking a job within a secular field, or simply having a really difficult conversation with a loved one, we need to step out in faith in order to ignite revival in our country. Through bold faith, not shying away from hard conversations, and asking hard questions, we can make waves in our culture that has been overrun by secularism. Thank you. I'm ready for questions.
I'll begin. I had the honor of mentoring Jake through this process, and seeing your passion on display in front of all of us is a very beautiful thing. I love that as you're writing your abstract, you start with intention in the world but not of it. You're speaking to primarily Christian audience right now, so I think as you say that, we can all relate to it. And then you create the tension with your thesis statement, with the indoctrination of the American population, just degrading the critical thinking. And for myself, this is creating tension in my spirit. So what are we supposed to do about it? Like, Jake, please tell us. And so then you do, and that's awesome. You draw our attention in. You explain issues that many of us as Christians are already aware of and concerned about, but we're not researching as you did and taking the steps to really understand it and see how we can be proponents of change. So I think you did a wonderful job. I was using my teacher voice. I think you did a wonderful job of creating the tension, stating the problems, stating the solution, drawing us in, and then telling us how we can be in the world and not of it. So, wonderful job.
Thank you for sharing your passion on this topic. I think that came across right from the opening paragraphs. You're very bold and strong in your language, but I loved that on a topic that I think is very contentious and mixed opinions, you were very neutral in your language. I love that you pointed out in the education paragraphs that the issue is not the inclusion of certain texts or perspectives being presented, but how they're being presented, that they're being presented as fact rather than theories. I think that's just such an important, excellent point that you made.
Thank you.
So I see you picked an easy topic. No, I want to praise you for your courage, because sometimes it's hard to write on things that are unfolding right before us. So if you're going to do the Civil War or Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, we've had time to ponder, think, lots of good writing. But what you're talking about is happening and changing as we speak. So first of all, kudos to your courage. I also appreciated calling out the Christian community in terms of not hiding, which becomes a culture in itself, or being so swept away in the culture that you forget to think. So good call to action, good critical thinking. Thank you for making us think. So, good job.
I think one of the challenges, as you pointed out, is that a lot of this language is not clearly defined. The terms woke, the terms critical thinking, and you kind of had to come up with your own definitions for these terms. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on when we have these disagreements on word meanings with one another, and that can kind of lead to us just talking past each other. How do we get on the same page? How do we land on definitions that we can agree on in order to move forward in a more productive conversation?
Yeah, so in my paper, this concept of critical thinking is something that hasn't been clearly defined. And so there was a point in which I was talking with my mentor and I was like, the thing is, a lot of people might not know what critical thinking is because of this crisis that I'm talking about in my paper. The fact that as a society, the very nature of what I was talking about, being able to think critically, is slowly degrading. And so a challenge I had was actually defining it, because it's very easy to define terms as using themselves, like using the words within what you're defining to define a thing. And within CC, we've been taught at a young age to define our terms. And so, like you were talking about, being sure that we are not arguing or having a disagreement or even having a discussion about these really heavy, important topics without first being sure that we're talking about the same thing. Because like you were saying, a lot of times you'll get into these really intense, heated discussions with people only to find out that you were talking about two entirely different things. And so, talking about the definition of critical thinking, the best way that I found to define it was to separate each of the terms in the word. So critical, which means very important, crucial, and then thinking is simply the act of using your mind. And so when you put it together, you get this definition, which means the act of intentionally or logically using your mind to make crucial decisions. And so from that, we've seen that, like I talked about throughout my paper, people are not using these skills as they once did because we live in a culture that promotes ease. The technological advancements that are made every day are to make our lives easier. And so if we're not having, like another thing I talk about in my paper, if we're not having these things that challenge us and that make us think critically, then naturally those skills are going to fall away.
Off of what you said, you did reference the critical thinking aspect in education, and you said, by accepting the culture's definition of safety, students' education and efficacy as individuals are at risk. The coddling of students is further adding to the crisis of passivity in our country. And I have had countless conversations with my students about how your brain is going to hurt if you're learning, because it's a muscle, it has to be stretched, it's going to be uncomfortable. And one of the sources that you used a few times in your paper, and I know it was very compelling to you, is the coddling of the American mind. So I would love for you to share how that resource taught you, what you learned from it, and how it just compelled you and propelled you forward as you wrote this paper.
Thank you. I originally found the book, it was a recommendation from a friend of mine, and right away from the title, it is a very controversial title, a very provocative title, and in the book they even say, we tried as hard as possible to make this, the title of this, as eye-catching as humanly possible, so because we believe that the information within it is so important that as many people as possible need to read it. Throughout reading the book, something that I didn't realize was how much study has been done about this, actually, this crisis of critical thinking and passivity. And there's actually, the two writers of this book wrote, originally the book was based off of an article that they wrote for The Atlantic, and it was talking about specifically in college environments, how they're seeing these students that are seeking safety from materials that they find challenging, and how the definition of safety has been changed to mean not facing adversity or challenges. And so, I'm trying to see exactly what I said. But so in my paper and also in that book, they really honed in on the fact of students are now equating physical danger from mental and emotional stress. Like they equate things that physically hurt them. So like you get a paper cut or you fall or you break a bone, they're equating that same pain as something where you encounter materials that are challenging, that are convicting even. And so this entire concept of safetyism was something that I was unaware of at the time. And so reading the book and reading through the studies that they had done and all of the information was really enlightening to me.
So you talk a lot about culture. Did you define culture in the paper? I think I might have missed it. How do you define culture?
I don't think I did.
Okay.
But I can talk a little bit on that. Something actually really interesting recently is in a text material that we use in class. It's called The Discoverers. It's a world history book. Recently they were talking about what culture means and how the meaning of culture itself has changed. So originally it was talking about a heritage, and then it went to the meaning change to talking about the actual act of cultivating something. And so now culture really means the ideas of a group of people, the driving force behind a lot of the agendas and ideologies that we're seeing right now is actually the culture. And culture is made up of individuals. I'm not sure where I said that in my paper, but I think I did a little bit. Culture is made up of individuals, and each of those individuals have a sphere of influence. And so when you're given a bunch of individuals that, something I talk about in my second proof is have herd mentalities. So this concept of jumping on the bandwagon per se. So it's, oh, well, everyone thinks this, so I guess I need to think this too, because, well, if 50 people say that this is right, then it must be. And that draw is so much stronger than we realize. And so with that, when you have a large group of people, you find this herd mentality. And so that creates this culture that pushes these agendas and ideologies.
Okay. You make a comment on page 3 in your abstract. We are at war with the culture. So would Black Lives Matter people agree with you on that statement?
I think that from people within those social movements, at the time, like right now, the culture is promoting those. So to them, no, they're not at war with the culture because the culture is what's being the proponents of those movements. And so to them, I think that they believe that they're in the right and that the culture is agreeing with them. So obviously, they must be correct in affirming their beliefs.
So I would argue that they would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're at war with a Christian Judeo culture.
Mm-hmm.
We're at war with a secular culture.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is, when you are very passionate, you make great arguments. If you read your paper, it's clear what you're fighting against. But I would encourage you to define your terms, because we're at war with the culture. Well, it depends what part of the culture you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So good job, but just encouragement to define terms clearly. Mm-hmm.
Bouncing off the idea of being at war with the culture, what are some practical ways you found in your research that we can engage in this battle without falling into the us versus them mentality, and maybe even specifically how you personally see yourself?
So I think that it's really easy for us as Christians to see everything that's happening in the culture and say, oh, but that's them, that's not me. Like, I don't do that. Like, specifically in the environments of, whether it's like the educational system. So a lot of times, like, obviously it's difficult to talk about since I'm a homeschooled Christian student, but it's really important for us, like I talked about, if you want to see the change, if you're praying for that the light would be seen and that these people would turn away from these destructive ideologies, then we need to do something about that. And so one of the most practical applications, honestly, in my opinion, is to be involved in those environments, to go into the world. So something that I go to this summer camp called Worldview Academy, and one of the days that you're there is you do evangelism training. So you're sent out into a main city area and you are street evangelizing. And it's an eye-opening experience, and it's so amazing because I think we can have a very removed viewpoint of all of this. So it's like, oh yeah, like we live in the Bible Belt, right? So we're not experiencing a lot of this. Even in our school systems, like there's going to be pushing of these ideologies, sure. But when you're in an environment where it's mainly Christians or just more conservative people, you're not experiencing the tension from the culture as much as you would in more liberal areas, like in the cities or places like that you hear about in the news all the time, California, New York, places like that. And so it's so eye-opening to then go into the cities around where you live and actually talk to people face to face and realize, no, these are real people. These are real people that really believe this. And it breaks your heart because it's like, it's so different going from saying, yeah, people can't think critically anymore, to then being face to face with someone who can't. And you see, we're like, okay, well, why do you believe that? Like, that's one of the main questions we ask at Worldview is how do you know? But what if you're wrong? How do you know what you're believing is true? And a lot of times it's just people will answer something like, I don't know, well, my dad told me, or you know what I mean? So it's so eye-opening and gives you so much compassion for people when you have these face-to-face experiences of people that are not thinking clearly and have not been able to express their ideas separate from the influence of the culture.
So you had 3 wonderful proofs, proving your thesis statement that the indoctrination of the American population is responsible for the degradation in critical thinking. Of the 3, education, social media and influence, social media and groups, which do you find the most compelling and why?
Although they are all 3 extremely important, and I would have loved to spend forever talking about any one of them individually, personally I think that the education, within the educational system, it's most important because the ideologies that I talk about later on in my 3rd proof are being introduced to these kids at a young age. And so, in reality, the pushing of these ideologies is started at a time where these students are not able to question authority yet because they're young, they're 4, they're 5. And so within these kindergarten environments, having these ideologies pushed as being factual, being true, or within the LGBTQ rights movement, being your choice. And it's up to you, and it's a personal choice, and everything is fluid. It creates such a damaging mindset for these young kids that impacts them throughout the rest of their life. And so I think over the next few years, and even already, we're going to see generations of people that lack these critical thinking skills because they are trained at a young age to not use them. Because they're told, this is your choice, this is fine, like you can be a unicorn if you want to, like all of these things that seem so good to these kids. And it, in reality, is creating these damaging, destructive habits and mindsets that they're not going to be able to necessarily come out of as easily because it was started at such a young age.
Is it possible not to be influenced by culture?
I don't think that it is because, like I say, we live in the world, but we're called to not become like it. And so it's a balancing act to live in that world, but also to not be swayed by the ideologies of the culture. And so really there's no way to be truly independent from the culture if you want to be in it and to fulfill the Great Commission.
So the best way then to avoid being swayed, recognize that you are being swayed.
Yeah, and honestly, like one of the main points of my paper, like in the end, something I came away with is more than being active and combating these ideologies, something you need to do is recognize that they're there first. And something I said in my abstract is to equip yourself with the knowledge necessary to combat the falsehoods. Because how are you going to effectively combat something of which you know nothing about? So it's a crucial aspect is truly understanding these people, understanding what they believe. To go back to worldview, one of the first years I interviewed this girl and she was Hindu. And so a lot of the conversation was spent me sitting there saying, okay, wait, so explain this to me. Like, I have no idea what this is. Like, I don't know a lot about this. Please just tell me what you believe. And so, honestly, I think that's the first step, is sitting down with people and having these conversations and saying, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me about that. Instead of immediately having this attitude of like, oh, but I know what you're doing is wrong and it goes against my beliefs, so I shouldn't interact with you, and I just need to try and share the truth with you as quick as possible. But it's like, the easiest way to do that is to actually genuinely get to know the person.
In your research process, was it challenging finding sources that you felt were unbiased, if that's even possible? And were there any sources that you felt put up any kind of good fight against your argument?
I think that with any source that you use, it is really difficult to find that are unbiased, and so the best way is to find something that's more neutral, so that's given arguments for both sides. Because, like we've talked about, you're never can be truly free from the influence of the culture, and even more so, that affects how you write. So, in the end of the day, all of these articles and essays and papers are all written by individuals. And so they have their own opinions, and so it's really, really difficult to be unbiased in that, especially if it's a topic that you're passionate about. But of all the sources that I used, probably the one that I found, two that I found most impactful was one called Christians in a Cancel Culture, and then the other was The Coddling of the American Mind. And with those two, after reading them, I was like, oh man, like that was everything I needed to say in my paper. I guess I don't need to say anything. But I think it's really important still. It was a really good skill for me to learn and to be able to do this really deep research and have discussions with my mentor about like all of the things I've been learning, and just really to dive deep and spend more time thinking about these topics critically.
So one of the transcendent themes through your entire paper is, and it was already addressed, the awareness that we are being swayed. I think we also discussed there's the awareness of the sin doesn't exist out there. The sin exists in my heart. So this isn't a culture problem, right? Ultimately, it's a sin problem. And so sometimes there can be a mindset that the sinners exist in the public school, or in a specific, or in the BLM movement, or in the LGBTQ movement. So, and you mentioned the call to action, but when you're addressing Christians on this matter, especially young people, there's a lot of young people in the room who can't currently be on the school board or currently be a public educator. How would you call your generation to action to love these people well and to be a voice that's countercultural, as we defined culture earlier? So
yeah, I think the way I would challenge my generation, people my age, honestly, is think about how many times, and I know this happens, your friends say something and you're like, you have that little internal bell that goes off in your head. It says, I don't know if that's true. Or, as a Christian, I don't think we should think about that way. And how many times you don't say anything because you fear being rejected by them, being canceled. And so we're being cornered into silence because of that fear. And so honestly, in a really practical sense, when you're talking with your friends or when you're your siblings or your family members, and you're coming across these just ideologies or opinions that you have that internal warning bell going off and saying, wait, like, I have a relationship with this person that I could say this. So that's the first thing too. Like we were talking about, build this relationship with this person that you can ask this. But then also, I really think, like I say in my my last sentence, is not be afraid to ask the hard questions and to have those difficult conversations. Because a lot of times, even as Christians, like, we want to be safe. We want to be comfortable. It's not comfortable being like, oh, I don't, as a Christian, like as your sister in Christ, I don't feel like this is the most beneficial thing for you. It's not a comfortable conversation. And so being willing to lovingly and with all the grace that the Lord gives us, be able to go into those conversations and say, I love you and I care about you, and this is why we're going to have this conversation, because I love you so much that I feel that it's my duty to say something.
So on a positive note, I think you are the embodiment of your paper. You are what you're calling people to be, critical thinker. So my question is, two questions. What drew you to the topic, and what surprised you most in your research?
I think what drew me to the topic most was honestly just encountering people in my own personal life that I felt convicted to say something, to address something that's being talked about, but didn't feel equipped, didn't feel like it was my job. I felt uncomfortable about it, like we're talking about, like I didn't want to create this controversy. I didn't want to be countercultural. And so honestly, thinking about that and thinking about my attitude towards people like that really drew me to this topic, because I was thinking about, okay, well, if I feel this way, certainly many other people do too. And also, just looking at the things that we're seeing in the world right now that we know are contrary to biblical truth. So, like Ashley was talking about in her paper, these agendas that are being pushed. I had this question in my mind saying, why is this so easily being accepted in all of these areas? Why are people just going along with it? Why are we not hearing more cases of people standing up and saying, no, this is wrong, we're not going to allow this to happen? And obviously, there are these things happening, but it's so much smaller, and we're not hearing about it as much as we should. And something that I found, I guess, most surprising was, I think honestly, in my first proof, talking about education, talking about how the definition of safety has changed. And so that was the most surprising to me, because, again, talking about definitions, I don't think many people realize that that's the root cause of a lot of this, is that these students in these college settings, in these K through 12 settings, are seeing this material as actually being harmful and dangerous to them. And so that was something that was really surprising to me, because I always thought, well, they found it, what's the word, triggering, right? They found it triggering, they found it uncomfortable, but I never thought they would see it as actually dangerous. And so that was the most surprising thing that I found.
And the fact, I'm on my tippy toes, I must have a tall person coming. The fact that they're all able to say, like Jane said, like Ashley said, and I think you're going to continue to hear that. To me, in listening to these, it would appear that we are living in times where our students are very aware of the erosion that is happening, and that it's happening in thought, in cinema, in writing, fairy tales and fiction. And like Jane was talking about, and Sarah will relate to this because Sarah found this when she did her senior thesis 2 years ago, there seems to be an intentional redefining of everything that we know in our reality to fit the current ideology. And when I sat with all of these students in class and we talked about their different topics, and Rebecca's going to talk about cell phones and apps, and Andrew's going to talk about the COVID scandal. And just the redefinition of what we know to be truth and all the different avenues that they're using to try to redefine what is truth. And as I'm sitting here, and I've spent an entire year with these topics, but as I'm sitting here listening to these kids speak from their hearts about it, I have such hope because of their awareness of what is going on. You know, it's hard to be duped when your eyes are open, and when you critically think about everything that's presented to you, whether it's in a movie or a book or on the news or on an app in your phone. And I don't remember a year where the topics have been so interconnected, which tells me, it just reinforces for me the importance of what they're talking about. Because at first I thought, wow, these are all really obscure. But as they started getting into it, I realized they're talking about different facets of the same thing. And that's just God's divine providence, that they get to hear about it from each other and further equipping each other before they leave. So I didn't know if you guys had realized it, but I sat over there going, wow. So without further ado, this one's mine.
Before we begin, first of all, apologies if my voice is a little hoarse. The pollen and me do not currently have a pact of non-aggression. And second, do all three judges have a copy of my senior thesis? Okay. Ready? Then let's begin. Good morning. My name is Brain Martin, and I will be presenting my thesis. Fairy tales are vital, not only in academic education, but also in mental, emotional, and spiritual instruction and development. Almost since the dawn of human civilization, people groups have crafted and shared fairy tales. First in oral tradition, and then, with the invention of writing, through literary formats. These fairy tales, which were passed down to each generation, were first used to explain observations in nature, and to convey history. With this practical and important information being wrapped in tales that also included moral, character, and spiritual lessons. Fairy tales were once used to educate in a variety of manners, but at the commencement of the modern era, they were more and more relegated to the nursery, serving only as entertainment. Subsequent to this demotion of fairy tales, much of the world has declined into a moral and ethical dark age. I, however, am here to tell you that contrary to seemingly popular opinion, the value of fairy tales extends far beyond mere passive entertainment. They are relatable, becoming personal to their audiences. They are approachable, useful for discussing difficult topics by people to see the point of view of others. And they are timeless, for their messages never lose their value or application to time. Some have claimed that fairy tales should not be used for instruction and education, even alleging that they are dangerous. These people say that fairy tales have harmful stereotypes, or are not inclusive of certain ideologies or identities, or are simply too grim for young people. However, these arguments are woefully inadequate. Fairy tales also contain positive role models for both male and female alike, teach traditional values with conventional family structures that do not need to be adapted to incorporate ideologies such as gender fluidity and homosexuality. And while the tales may contain elements that seem scary to some, they are not designed to frighten, but rather to teach valuable moral, character, and spiritual lessons. Educators from all spheres, whether in traditional school settings or in homeschool, no matter what level, elementary, intermediate, high school, or collegiate, should resolve to use traditional fairy tales to educate. Their intent should not be just to entertain audiences, but to use them as vehicles to convey hope in a world that seems hopeless, as moral and character standards that are necessary to redeem our world, as encouragement to stand up to the dragons of this and future ages, while ever motivating readers and hearers towards truth. As C.S. Lewis said in a New York Times article in 1956, sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said. Thank you. am now ready to take questions.
First off, I want to say, as a teacher of English for 20 years, well done on the depth of research that you had to perform in order to gather information on this particular topic. I know you ran into some difficulties with the research, and I'd like for you to share them at some point in this conversation here. But your premise of fairy tales as a vehicle for truth is phenomenal. One of the things that we find out is that in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are two distinct presentations. The New Testament is primarily a doctrinal presentation, except for the character, the prime character of Jesus, who comes in and he tells stories. And he tells parables, he tells allegories, and that gives people doctrine, but it puts that doctrine into the context of a situation or an environment. And that's what fairy tales do. It gives us truth, but it also gives us truth in the context of a meaning, and that's what your paper communicates very, very clearly. And so you did a phenomenal job on that. Well done.
Thank you.
I printed this out. I hope I have enough paper in my printer, but I love braid writing, and I've loved braid writing for several years now, and so it was hard to put down. So it was a page turner. I loved how you put this together. And I do appreciate that you gave me a tool to use to share the gospel and to just relate and give the glory to God. It's a very practical tool. And so I appreciate how you also compare the fairy tales to Jesus' use of parables, and just a reminder that we can use anything. And the integrity of these fairy tales do need to be upheld in order for us to relate to people. Good job.
A good apologetic for fairy tales and for stories in general. So, as someone who's been in the church and went to seminary and was told to use big fancy words and theological deep things, I've always been intrigued by the fact that Jesus told such simple stories. And so, as Ashley said, movies shouldn't sound like sermons. My answer is maybe sermons should be more like movies. At least that's what Jesus did. So, I have been to more salutatory and valedictory addresses than I can remember, and I don't remember hardly any of them, but I still remember the parables, I still remember fairy tales. So good job reminding us of the value of these stories.
So throughout all of your research, you say fairy tales should be included, they should be a part of our education, okay? What do you see as the next steps? How do you go about, how do we as a culture go about reincorporating those fairy tales in our education?
Well, probably first step would be identifying which fairy tales teach lessons, because most fairy tales teach a lesson, but there are some more modern ones which are just plain silly tales that really don't belong in the realm of fairy tales. So identifying fairy tales with lessons in them that are useful would probably be a first step. It shouldn't be too hard since that's almost all. Second step would probably be identifying fairy tales which are suitable for different ages, because some fairy tales have too advanced lessons and other tales have rather gruesome scenes in them that don't need to be told to toddlers, or at least they need to be watered down a little. And then pretty much just using the stories.
So are you in favor of maybe like the movies, people writing modern fairy tales?
Absolutely. As long as they don't either, like Ashley said, drum hard on the moral and just forget character development or story plot, and as long as they don't try to put ideologies that don't belong in fairy tales into the stories they're writing.
So we need to have a movie called Fairy Tale?
There are plenty of those. And honestly, most of them don't even belong.
So I guess you're against Shrek?
Well, I'm fine if the movies stay true to the fairy tale, but the instant they start incorporating their own ideologies that don't belong, I just want to kick them to the curb.
Who do you think most needs to hear your message about this perpetuation of fairy tales? You mentioned that, well, like, obviously children learn them early. You even mentioned it was a great place for adults to escape the grind. And you even said something about people with brain injuries relating. Is there a particular group that you think?
Probably mostly anyone in a position of teaching, namely parents, teachers, professors, and so on. Anyone who gives instruction.
The question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And so it's kind of a riddle sort of question. Fairy tales somewhat reflect culture, but fairy tales also certainly dictate culture for the next generation. So my question is, which should the role of fairy tales do? Should these stories shape the culture, or should they be a reflection of the culture?
Well, the fairy tales we're talking about teach lessons, and therefore they morph the culture. They help develop it. Fairy tales that come out of the culture only tell what the culture does. So since we're talking about fairy tales to teach lessons to the culture, we're talking about the fairy tales that change the culture.
From an educational perspective, okay, you declared in your paper that it conveys, fairy tales convey hope. They are moral and spiritual guidance. Is your assumption, in your position, that the role of education should be not just to teach reading skills, writing skills, but also to teach moral, spiritual lessons as well?
Absolutely. I believe that pretty much anything that can be learned is supposed to be like spaghetti, all intertwined. There isn't supposed to be like separate subjects, history, geography, theology. They should all just be one subject, really.
I like how you said that it's not uncommon for the reader to insert themselves in the place of the protagonist. Do you think that currently there's an overabundance of anti-heroes in our culture that are glorifying immoral behavior or promoting immoral behavior?
Short answer, yes. And long answer, all you have to do is look at the news and see that evil is glorified, such as someone robbing a house or something. And it is talked about much more than, say, just someone being nice to another person, like helping an elderly lady across the street. You hardly hear about something like that. But just look at a news article and you'll see page after page about something bad that happened.
So I think one of the difficulties in this is whether it's movies or artwork or songs. I mean, millions are written, only a few survive because they're the classics. So the fairy tales you list are the classics, yes? It seems to me that there's going to have to be more modern ones written, and some will be, as you say, not worth much, but maybe a few will be good. So what are some modern fairy tales that have been written that you think, hey, these have a chance of being classics?
There have only recently been a few modern ones that have been written. One, of course, is the Green Ember series by S.D. Smith. He's also writing another series, which is called the Wayland Saga, I believe. That's a good one. Another good one, I believe, are the Dragon Keeper, which are basically an allegory for Christ. Another one is the Kingdom series, also an allegory for Christ. There aren't too many other very recent ones, but a couple of the not so recent ones by Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are also good.
Go ahead and talk about at this point your struggles for the research.
Yes, I had a very difficult time researching for this topic. It wasn't so hard to find things against fairy tales, except for in my third proof, where I changed that multiple times. But finding any real research on the topic of fairy tales that was in the affirmative was pretty difficult because ultimately all that was written by most authors was who wrote them. That was all the arguments I found. There was hardly anything in the affirmative that stated that spoke to my thesis. The negative was also pretty scarce, but not as scarce.
And one of the reasons, one of the things we ran into was the timeliness of the research, is that there was
Yes.
not a lot written in recent years about fairy tales, simply because fairy tales were not a part of popular culture, of educational culture. Throughout your research, when did you find fairy tales disappearing from this time of education and training, and what was the circumstances you found surrounding their removal?
Pretty much the last great discussions about fairy tales really occurred during the era of Tolkien and Lewis. That was really where most of the articles I found were from. More recently, pretty much all the articles have been debates about who wrote them and whatnot, or by the leftist societies, how we should change them to include their agendas. That's pretty much it I found.
And what did you find as the removal from culture, from education, from the traditional role of the fairy tale, and from its removal and relegation to nurseries, as you mentioned in your paper?
Could you restate that?
What did you find in your research as the primary reason for removing fairy tales from the culture?
Well, most of the primary reasons I found was, first of all, they just were too silly. They were about children, and therefore people thought they should be for children. Had no real purpose for adults. And since they were for children, they couldn't have any tangible value, and therefore were only good for entertainment. That was the first one I found. Other ones have been that, as I stated, contain harmful stereotypes or are not inclusive of other ideologies. Those are pretty much the main ones, other than also that they were a little gruesome. But that one was surprisingly difficult to find. I've talked to a decent number of parents and other teachers, and that is almost always, if they have reasons against fairy tales, that is almost always the first argument they give. But I had to go on a literal manhunt to find any article that said that. I only found one article that said that out of 150 maybe.
You say that fairy tales can be a vehicle for helping individuals understand the position and perspective of others, even when the topic is controversial, and then also that they are enjoyable, relatable, memorable, and it paves the way for discourse. Have you actually had an opportunity to use these?
A couple times, yes. I sometimes use stories or analogies when I'm talking.
Any specifics?
None recently.
So I think one of the difficulties for all of us is, and we've talked about this already, is that when we're disagreeing with people, how to listen and take their concerns seriously. So if fairy tales reflect culture, then there probably are some stereotypes in fairy tales. So how do you help answer, how do you listen to your critics and acknowledge, yes, there are some stereotypes, however, here's the value?
Well, remember what I said about how it should be, we go through them and find what fairy tales should be given to certain ages? Mm-hmm. Well, yes, there are definitely some fairy tales that contain harmful stereotypes. I can't off the top of my head think of any examples, but they are there. So it should be that fairy tales should be chosen for each age group based off what the parents believe their child is ready for, or hopefully the teachers are wise enough and knowledgeable enough to choose them if they're using them in that setting. Basically, stories like, if we're going off of harmful stereotypes, mainly female stereotypes, fairy tales that contain a strong female heroine, such as like Cinderella or one of the other great heroines, should be used at the younger ages where that is enforced. And later on you can incorporate the ones that are more stereotypical against women as they get older and have more developed cognitively. If that made any sense.
I do like your quote about, when you open the introduction with the Chesterton quote. I love that fairy tales do not tell children dragons exist. Children know dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children dragons can be killed. So are you trying to say that fairy tales inspire creativity, imagination?
Not so much creativity. In that quote, I'm trying to say that fairy tales don't tell children that evil and badness exists. In that quote, I'm trying to say people already know about that from the moment they're born. But fairy tales tell them the evil and the badness can be overcome. That's what that quote is trying to say.
Tie that to your statement that fairy tales convey.
Well, as I said, because they teach us that the wrong and whatever is bad can be overcome, it gives us hope. Because the opposite of that, if we don't believe they can be, is hopelessness. And since we show the opposite of hopelessness, we give them hope.
One of the things in your paper that kind of surprised me was that fairy tales originally were written for adults. So that was interesting.
Well, I don't suppose any of you have read the Myth of Adolescence or anything. Basically, it talks about how adolescents and teenagers and whatnot is a recent invention. Back in the old days, as soon as a child could think, pretty much, and walk, he was considered an adult, like at age 7 or say. There were only two classes of people, the infants and the adults. There was no such thing as a childhood.
So when did fairy tales then go from being something that was serious and adult more for children?
Probably around the era that childhood was invented, say when the idea of the rich families with their nurses and nannies and whatnot.
I love that you talked about art and how the children were made just little adults. And that never occurred to me as that was I thought it was just bad art. No, it had meaning. It had meaning. It was so amazing.
You mentioned in your paper similarities between fairy tales and culture, like a story mirrors appears in Europe, but it also appears in the United States and appears in Asia. Talk to us about the rhyming nature of fairy tales across culture.
Okay, so as I mentioned in my paper, we have all over the world fairy tales. One of the strangest things about fairy tales is that they all seem to be similar in one way or another. For example, the story of Cinderella exists all over the world, just with slight variations. In China, the glass slipper we are so familiar with, our fairy tales, is actually made of grass. And in other countries, it's made of silver, and in some it's made of gold.
Other than these details, are the lessons the same?
The story is generally the same as well. To continue off of the Cinderella example, sometimes the stepsisters receive a punishment at the end, but in others they do not and get off free. In some, the fairy godmother is replaced by a magical tree, and in still others, wait, what was that? Sorry, lost my train of thought. Never mind then. And basically, they're all the same story, they're just different. No one knows exactly where the fairy tale began, but it is now all over the world.
And each one has the same sort of lesson where the girl is, the heroine is.
Yes, it has the same basic story.
it would be fun to do a research on each individual. Why it's glass here, why it's gold over here. There's an essay in that.
I imagine someone could write an essay, but for me, especially during the course of writing this paper, I am mostly a creative writer, not a paper writer. I much prefer writing creative stories or something like that. I do not enjoy researching and writing out someone else's facts.
So I think we have your calling, more than one, to write our generation's fairy tale.
Maybe.
So Jane is going to tell us the critical issues. You're going to write the fairy tale and Ashley will make it a movie.
Anything else?
Have you written some? And do you have one more to share?
I have several that I've written, but they are not to the point where I would say I'm ready to pass them out. At least in my opinion. I don't know what anyone else would say.
So globally, knowing what you know now about fairy tales, about your research process, is there anything you would have changed about what you did, how you began, what you were researching?
Probably I would have just gone straight for the proofs and reputation proofs that I have already, because I changed them so many times in the course of my research, because simply, as I said, it was hard to find anything, because either it was all talking about who wrote them and debating on that, or it was just people were talking about how they're full of false stereotypes or are not inclusive. It was very difficult to find actual research papers that were relatively recent. As a matter of fact, most of the things we found were from 1800, 18 to 1900, to be more precise, with only a handful of modern ones.
So in writing this paper and your research, what surprised you the most?
The lack of research. That's the short answer.
What did you enjoy the most?
Probably, ultimately, it was finishing the paper. But during the writing process of the paper, I probably enjoyed the most where I could actually state my opinion and be a little more creative in my writing, namely the abstract, reputation, and conclusion.
What really intrigued you? What rabbit trails did you find that you didn't have time to really research and dig into or include in the paper, because you were very focused and logical and sequential throughout the paper? But what was there about what you found that, if I had some extra time and I had a little bit of inclination and pushing, I would really like to know more about this topic, this fairy tale, this tangentially related item to fairy tales?
Well, probably most was when I was researching the course, I ran across a couple of fairy tales that I didn't know, and I wanted to dive in and read them. Most of the time I resisted the urge. But another thing is probably, in a few cases I ran up against people who argued where they were from. That was the only other rabbit trail, really. But again, I didn't have time to look into that, even though it was kind of interesting.
Is there a particular fairy tale you'd like you said you read some new ones. Are there any that we probably haven't read that?
There are so many in my head, I could not begin to choose a favorite. The tale of Atheniona from Ireland is a very good tale, rather strange. There are also like the tales of Odin and Thor from Norse mythology, and from Greek mythology, of course, though I wouldn't recommend that for younger readers. It's also pretty good. Japanese fairy tales are very fun.
What makes them fun?
Probably their innocence, surprisingly. Most Japanese fairy tales are surprisingly innocent in their design.
Did you find any, like, we've been talking about different countries, are there different themes from different countries or different stylistic differences? Like Japanese or innocent?
Not really. Generally, fairy tales are all very similar. Of course, the scenery and, for example, in Japan and China, you run across tigers, and in Europe, you run across bears and wolves. And also, jungle versus temperate forest. You run across that a lot, but other than that, there's not really much difference.
They don't need me.
Good morning. My name is Rebecca Alexander, and my senior thesis is children under 16 should have limited access to smartphones. I want to thank you all for coming here today, and a special thank you to my judges for reading my paper and preparing questions. And so seated next to my father in the train compartment, I suddenly asked, "Father, what is sexing?" He turned to look at me, as he always did when answering a question, but to my surprise, he said nothing. At last, he stood up, lifted his traveling case from the rack over our heads, and set it on the floor. "Will you carry it off the train, Corey?" I stood up and tugged at it. It was crammed with the watches and spare parts he had purchased that morning. "It's too heavy." "Yes," he said, "and it would be a pretty poor father who would ask his little girl to carry such a load. It's the same way, Corey, with knowledge. Some knowledge is too heavy for children. When you are older and stronger, you can bear it. For now, you must trust me to carry it for you." Smartphones are increasingly widespread throughout the USA and the world. A smartphone usually has an LED touchscreen, easy internet access, and apps can be easily downloaded onto it. On the other hand, a cell phone or basic non-smartphone is not as popular because its main functions are limited to calling and texting. A basic phone's pixelated screen affects the eyes and brain differently than an LED screen, and the pixelated screen does not suck in people's attention as strongly. Children under 16 should have limited access to smartphones because of the physical, mental, and emotional dangers that smartphones expose them to. Throughout the first couple of years of a child's life, he or she is developing rapidly, both mentally and physically. Neural connections are being made all over the place in the child's mind, and he or she is learning new skills within short windows of time. Throughout the teenage years, any unused neural connections from their childhood are pruned away, section by section, from back to front. The last section of the brain to mature is the frontal lobe, which is the center for emotional regulation and impulse control. One form of harmful radiation is called Wi-Fi. Some studies on mobile phone radiation on mice and chicken embryos indicate that a large amount of radiation exposure has negative effects. Parents should take extra care with their children because a child's skull is thinner than an adult's, allowing the radiation to penetrate farther into the child's brain. While not much is known about the effects of Wi-Fi radiation on humans, there have been several studies on blue light and its impact on people. Light plays an important role in the body's circadian rhythm. Handing a blue light emitting device to a child or teenager will negatively impact their ability to maintain a regular sleep schedule because their frontal lobe is not matured enough to resist the device's temptation. Another point to consider, kind of adding on to that, is smartphone addiction. Dopamine is an endorphin that boosts feelings of pleasure and plays a role in habit forming. It is also linked to motivation and memory. Social media apps are designed with algorithms that take advantage of dopamine rushes and encourage checking the app as many times as possible and staying on the app for as long as possible. A few reasons parents give their child a smartphone is to equip them to handle technology, to establish a constant means of communication, and to entertain them. Equipping their children to safely navigate today's technology is an important thing for parents to do. However, just handing a child a smartphone is not a good idea, given that smartphones are designed to be as attention-grabbing as possible, and kids have little to no self-control. Establishing a means of contact is also important, but a smartphone is not required to do so. Basic cell phones with call and text-only settings are the best option for kids until they're old enough and mature enough to deal with a smartphone. Training children is hard work, but responsible parents do not take the easy way out and replace discipleship with an electronic device. Children under 16 should have limited access to smartphones because of the physical, mental, and emotional dangers that smartphones expose them to. While 16-year-olds still have a lot of growing and maturing ahead of them, they still have several more years at home, so 16 is a good age to give them a smartphone. 16-year-olds are no longer little children, and they need to start acting like adults, but they still live at home with their parents' guidance and rules. Our youth are our future. Right now, we are watching our society implode. If we want a healthy society in the future, if we want our country to survive, much less thrive in the coming years, we must raise our youth in a healthy and godly manner. Parents need to carefully research smartphones and decide for themselves if they will allow their children to own this technology and at what age they will allow it. Thank you. Now it's time for questions.
Thank you for sharing. I think this is such an interesting and important topic. I really enjoyed reading your perspective. I just wanted to say, first off, I loved the quote from The Hiding Place. It doesn't relate to technology specifically, but it really just elevated your argument, showing that this is a timeless concern, and your greater point is the knowledge that children are equipped to handle. And I love how you tied it back in at the end. I just thought it was so creative and poetic.
Thank you. Second, all of that, Rebecca, your paper was so well structured and organized. I was gripped by the exordium, and then throughout with your literary devices, that just the comparisons and things that really just nailed things, really well. I just thought it was excellent. You did wonderful.
I want to second what she said about loving the quote, that some knowledge is too heavy for children. There's a biological reason that it's too heavy for children, as well as, obviously, the children not knowing how to handle the actual information that you referred to. In your very good summary of a long paper into a short brief or abstract for us, you alluded to pruning. And I think that this might benefit from a little bit more explanation of the plasticity of children's brains. What is neural pruning, and how does that lead to long-term potentiation of adults' ability to, one, learn new things, and two, be affected by things? First off, what is the plasticity that you allude to in the paper? Or that you actually talk about in the paper?
Can you rephrase that, please?
Okay. What is the plasticity of a child's brain? I'm going to help you out. It's in the paper, and she actually did research it and talk about it. So I'm going to just help you out with that part and then go on to my second part. In the child's brain, there are lots of nerve
endings available and pathways that can be taken, and a child is free for connections to be made, and they are free to learn whatever is presented to them very easily. And then sometime running from teenagehood up until early 20s, the brain starts to prune back and clip nerves, pathways that haven't made connections. And then what's left over get myelinated to where those pathways work better and faster, and the people know that information well, but it's hard to learn new things, and it's hard to accept things that would have gone along those weird pathways that got pruned because they were not used. So the pathways that are not used get pruned away, and we end up as we are as adults by pruning away all the bad stuff. So, and you talked about that in your paper. So, can you list some of the knowledge which is too heavy for children and the effects exposure to that knowledge might have on neural pruning? You referred to lots of the types of knowledge that the internet brings us in the paper.
Yeah.
So what are those pieces of knowledge that the children might be exposed to?
Well, children on the internet anyhow, children might be exposed to, I'll just say, adult content, inappropriate stuff that they can't, they don't need to be exposed to, and they don't, need to be exposed to it because they can't handle it, because that's kind of higher level.
Right, so you mentioned adult content and the fact that, all right, so if those areas are built up, then they won't be pruned later on, and they may have more of a desire to continue along those. Now, what about some of the topics that your colleagues and you in your paper said is coming across the internet to affect our culture? Is there anything else there that they might be exposed to?
Well, like Jane said, with the woke ideologies being spread to children even at young ages, that'll affect them. That'll affect them badly, because children are so, let's say, absorbative.
Right.
So absorbative.
The plasticity of the brain at this point, they'll accept anything and make those connections.
Yeah, and then it'll be, as they grow older, and also kind of like Jane said, once kids get into those patterns of thought with, we could say, adult content, with woke ideologies, and with other things like that, they don't need to have access to, because it's inappropriate for them if it gets into their brain at a young age and they get ingrained in those. If it doesn't get pruned, which it probably won't, then that'll be a long-term effect.
Very good. And they also talked about some of the truths, things we say, how can you believe that? And they're saying it's true. Well, if you teach our children that they teach the children that it's true because they're going all by themselves without supervision, then that's going to remain within the connections when they're older. I really appreciated obviously your section on the pruning and the impact that has, and the fact that pruning doesn't occur until an older age.
I thought you were so measured in presenting some of the opposing sides of view from a parent's perspective or adult's perspective. I was interested if you found any information or research on screen time for children presented on a non-smart device. For example, is it okay for a kid to have a Fire tablet, a Kindle, something maybe that doesn't have access to the internet, or would you say that exposure from whether it's blue light or other radiation, other things that you're talking about, no screens for children, or some screens are okay?
I mean, I would kind of lean towards little to no screens, but especially not smartphones. Because I didn't do a lot of research on other devices, on tablets, on TVs, or on like basic cell phones, but because of the blue light, that would be something to I mean, I think all electronic devices emit blue light, and so that is something that definitely should be taken into account. I'm mainly focused on smartphones because those are especially, I mean, I'm sure it's all designed to be addictive, but those are, yeah, more common. He's like, they're more common, they're more newer, I guess, and plus I had to narrow my topic down, so I just kind of chose smartphones, if that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Bouncing off of that, tell me, which proof did you find most compelling? In your words, which one really resonated with you to really defend that 16-year-olds and under need to stay away from smartphones?
I think in my third proof, when I talk about TikTok and its algorithms, there was a study, or I didn't read my paper, where some researchers, they created several accounts on TikTok, put their ages as 13, and within a few minutes, after indicating that they were unhappy on those accounts, they were getting pro-suicide, pro-self-harm, video, reels and content. That really struck me, and I thought that was, I mean, it's horrible. Say 13-year-olds, they can't handle that information. They don't need to have access to that information, and plus that's right before puberty, and there's, with puberty and all the hormones and all the mental and physical changes, they're not 13-year-olds. And that age group, they're not prepared, they're not mentally able to make good decisions with that information, going, oh, this is silly, oh, this is not good, this is, hurting myself because I'm not happy is not a good idea because, well, it's really just not. And so that especially struck me. And I know TikTok is really popular, and so that was another kind of that just really struck me.
Can you expand, because this was gripping for me, the TikTok example you gave, the research study about the 10 minutes on TikTok for 13-year-olds and under? They created accounts. Mm-hmm. Can you share that? That was really good. It's on page 10.
Yeah. I actually didn't do a ton of research on this. What would you like me to expand on?
Just how 13-year-olds, they created accounts and then they looked at just somewhat controversial subject areas through TikTok, whether they use a search engine that was shouldn't have led them into the darker corners of TikTok, but it only took just one search and it happened where they were then sent all of this information that would carry them further into, And I may have summarized it enough for you. It was just really gripping. I love that you used it. It just was great evidence to support your proof.
Yeah, you did summarize it pretty well. And from what I understand, it wasn't necessarily a search. It was just they were, I guess, just scrolling, and within a few minutes they were getting pro-suicide, pro-self-harm videos. Yeah.
A gentleman, maybe not a gentleman, a man named Vladimir Ulyanov, otherwise known as Vladimir Lenin, was the head of Soviet Russia and later the Soviet Union until his death in 1924 while it transitioned into communism. He has two quotes: "Give me just one generation of youth and I'll transform the whole world. And then give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted." So in your research, did you find, and if you did find any, can you tell us about any evidence that the forces behind messaging on the internet and their agendas are in any way targeting children so that the sown they will see will never be uprooted? Are they targeting children with their messaging and their software and all that?
I believe so, yes. Just with the example of TikTok, with the example of TikTok, that's a pretty clear target. They're not protecting children. They're going after them, but seeking to ruin them. And I believe in other. Let's see.
In the research that you provided me as mentor, you did include some articles where it documented software designers and software companies intentionally using things we've learned from addiction and addictive behavior to target children with that type of information. So you did find it, and I appreciated that.
You recommended 16 as the age to receive a smartphone, and you did say you would leave it up to the parent or adult's discretion. But besides the environmental factor of the child most likely being at home still, were there any other physical or mental, emotional developments that take place around that age that make you think that's a good 16 is a recommended age to have a smartphone?
Other than the fact that, 16-year-olds are usually still at home, so they usually have they're not at the beginning of puberty. They've kind of like progressed some, and they're still at home, so they still have their parents' hopefully protection and guidance. And other than that, not really. I didn't do a ton of research on that, actually.
So while you were researching, was there something that you came across that you felt was interesting, or that maybe you felt like you would like to research further? You didn't have a place for it in this paper, but you were really interested in learning more about?
During my research, I came across, I watched The Social Dilemma, which is a documentary. I don't remember who it was, but like a documentary about some of the apps and some of the they talked to some of the designers of like Google and Facebook and Gmail and Instagram, and something I found very interesting was that I found that even the designers of the algorithms and the people who helped design the color schemes, the formats of some of those apps, they designed them to attract attention and to keep attention, to essentially to be addictive. Even those people who designed those apps, they themselves were addicted to those apps. That's something that I found very interesting, and probably would have liked to dig in farther, but I wasn't able to because of time.
So you're saying this addiction, kind of like a drug addiction. What is the harm of addiction to phones?
Well, I mean, if you're addicted to your phone, you're not spending as much time with other people, with your kids if you're a parent, with I want to say tangible things. You're just you're spending all your time and energy in this little device that's in front of you instead of paying attention to what's around you. And
That's very good.
Yeah.
In your paper, you actually quoted a definition of addiction, and part of that definition said that there is no concern at the time about the consequences of pursuing it, whatever it is you're addicted to, whether it's a drug, whether it's a phone, or otherwise. Anyone who has a smartphone, I imagine, can think of times when they were using their smartphone, knew there were other things they should be doing, but I'm not going to be concerned at the time about the consequences of pursuing my time on my smartphone. You're going to ignore the responsibilities of your life. And so, yeah, the addiction, addictive behavior, it's not like drugs. It is like drugs. Drugs takes you away from dealing with the responsibilities of real life. So does your smartphone. For some people, their smartphone takes them away from real life a whole lot more than the time that drugs take those drug addicts away from their life. And it's not as obvious, it doesn't have the stigma.
Of the points you covered, addiction, anxiety, maybe inability to focus. I mean, let's say we can put, we have blue light blocking glasses nowadays, like maybe we can protect them from some of the more immediate physical effects. What would you say is the most harmful aspect of smartphones for children?
Probably the internet access, because of all the things on the internet and because it's so easy to get onto the internet and to download apps like TikTok or like other things, other harmful apps. That's probably what I would say. The easy internet access is probably the main, I would say my main concern with smartphones, if that answers your question.
And how would you then, for those parents that say they want their children to be exposed to technology and develop that skill while their brain is still plastic and they can learn so easily, do you have any suggestions about how to let the kids gain that technology experience without putting them in harm's way as far as the information that they might get from the internet while they are getting that technology experience?
I mean, I would say maybe expose them on a computer or something, so it's not a smartphone. I mean, you can still access the internet on a computer, but I feel like a computer would be a little bit easier to monitor than a smartphone. But that's just my personal opinion.
I would agree that to try to have all technology interaction be supervised to where if they're starting to go somewhere they shouldn't have started this, you can help to redirect before too many new connections get made. And so just supervision, don't just give it to them and say, off to your room and have fun with it.
Yeah,
So,
it's horrible. 2 minutes. In your paper, you gave us 3 reasons why parents give their children a smartphone. Would you touch on that, expand on it to us, maybe if you found one to be more harder to refute than the others? What are your comments on that? I can remind you of the reason is to equip them with technology and to establish constant means of communication. You know, if your child's at a game or needing to be in contact for an emergency, and then they also do it to entertain them, to kind of step away from that discipleship that you touched on.
Which one is the hardest to refute?
Yes, I would say as you're working through this.
I would say the constant means of communication, because, I mean, in my paper I didn't say don't give them any, I'm not saying don't give your kids phones at all, I'm just saying not smartphones. So I feel like I wasn't, I guess, as firm on that point, because I realized that parents want to know where the kids are, they want to make sure that they're safe, and I understand that. I mean, especially nowadays, you need a way to contact your kids. So I feel like I didn't go as hard on that one because it's like, well, you need some way to contact your kids. So.
The question was, would you like to share your experience going from a flip phone, which provides communication without the internet, to actually moving to a smartphone when you were presumably 16?
Well, it's every bit as addictive as this is said, as all the research has said. It's been difficult for me because, I mean, it's like it's a smartphone. I want to say it's new, it's shiny. I haven't had one before, and I guess because of the novelty and because of the ease of everything, it's just more engaging. I mean, I liked my little flip phone, but it's difficult because I realize I'm a little addicted to my smartphone, and I realize that, and I don't like that, but what can I say?
And you're how old?
18.
Right.
And I think I had a flip phone when I was about 16, and so I only got a smartphone in January when I actually turned 18. So
that answers your question about 16. She was giving grace. Rebecca has lived what she just reported. Okay, anything else? Good. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Okay, last but certainly not least, we put Andrew at the end so you all can pay attention to the rest of it. Because this is very tough. Not that the rest are not. This is a hot button topic, right? All right, I'm going to let him have the floor. And then we'll be finished. Yay! Who's this, Sarah?
That was Joanne about Maggie.
Joanne?
Or Joanna.
Can you look at what you're doing?
Still need.
Or
I think that was it.
Still need. That's pressing the hold button. Is that better or not?
Let me look.
Am I good? All right. Good morning. My name is Andrew Lomax. I'm going to be presenting my senior thesis. The U.S. federal government withheld data and information from the American people during the COVID pandemic by influencing the media, prioritizing the mRNA vaccine, and silencing the healthcare professionals. Before I begin, I realize that this topic is heavily controversial, and so all I ask is that you just listen and with an open mind to what I have to say. Who can you trust? In December 2019, first discovered in China, the virus, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, informally known as COVID-19, spread to the world. This virus caused people to live in fear and panic in the following years. The fear of unknown controlled people, and they looked to government for answers. A vaccine promised safety and protection from this virus. Vaccine companies Pfizer and Moderna, with the help of the federal government, developed and administered an mRNA vaccine, a new technology for treating and preventing COVID, just under 2 years after the introduction of the virus under an emergency use authorization. The solution was perfect, almost too perfect. Many simply followed. Some were skeptical, but few pursued truth. The truth seekers wanted to see the whole picture and take into consideration the information and data from all sides, both from the government and from outside sources. So what do the numbers say? Today, post-pandemic and post-vaccination discoveries have been made. The two highlighted findings are the number of reports of young, healthy people dying after the introduction of the vaccine and the data of the all-cause mortality rate of the working class. The suppression of information has led people to believe that the death has subsided since the pandemic in 2020. But many young people have died suddenly of unknown causes, beginning in 2021 and continuing to this day. The all-cause mortality rate of the working class, a 50 to 100% increase in excessive deaths across all age groups, aged 25 to 64, in the third quarter of 2021, when the vaccine mandates were released, confirms a death epidemic in the healthy working people. The only thing that changed in 2021 was the vaccine approval and mandates for these many working people. The government does not address nor suggest the idea of a correlation between vaccines and this death epidemic. Through misinformation and censorship, the government silenced anyone, especially healthcare professionals, who should be considered an authority on COVID, who opposed the idea of the government's pro-mRNA vaccine and pro-government control stance. The U.S. federal government withheld data and information from the American people during the COVID pandemic by influencing the media, prioritizing the mRNA vaccine, and silencing the healthcare professionals. As Christians, we should be assessing the information that surrounds us daily and actively search for truth. What was surprising and concerning was how easily people trusted their government without question, without their lie detectors sounding the alarm. Do we seriously think that our government, whose worldview has no reason for upholding biblical morals, is incapable of lying? As Christians, have we forgotten about the brokenness and corruption of our world and of our country? We let fear control us. The fear of uncertainty, the fear of death, the fear to stand up, crippled and consumed us. It is time to wake up to reality. The time we live in requires we courageously seek the truth, to critically think in the midst of lies and deception. We must remember who we are and whose we are. Understanding the government's potential to lie must release a fiery passion inside us to seek the truth. Through critical thinking and understanding the brokenness of our world and of our government, we must know the truth and reveal it to the world. Thank you.
question, I'll break the ice for you. First of all, I want to recommend everybody read this paper. Well documented, well written, and the courage to speak on something most people literally are afraid to even talk about for fear of being canceled. So I want to commend you for the courage that's needed to take on something like this.
Thank you.
Now, because of that, I'd like to ask you a few softball questions first. Now I'm going to get you some hardballs, okay? First in softball, what sparked your interest in this topic, number one? And number two, how are you going to put this great information that you have correlated into use?
Okay.
So what sparked your interest, and how are you going to use it?
I think what sparked my interest about this is, obviously, to me, it kind of felt like the whole pandemic of COVID just kind of came upon us. Like, it was just kind of out of the blue. And I just kind of wanted an answer. I wanted to see what was, after 3 years of this happening, what took place in this whole process. Because I feel like it's changed a whole lot throughout these 3 years. And so that's kind of what sparked my interest. Was I wanted to see what really kind of happened looking back 3 years, because I feel like in the midst of it, we didn't have the information available that we do today. So that's kind of what sparked more of my interest in it. And then your second question was,
how are you going to put this great information to use?
I feel like telling as many people as possible is how I'm going to put it to use. Sharing it, being not afraid to stand up and tell the truth, that's where it's going to have the most impact. Whether that's in your social groups, communities, the culture. I feel like the more conversations had on this topic, the better, and the bigger impact it will have on people.
Okay, one thing I want to commend you on is your focus on seeking truth and the importance of asking questions. This quote comes from your paper. These questions are being asked and these statements are being suggested not to push for government skepticism, but in order to find the truth, and finding the truth starts with asking questions. So thank you for pushing us all to think more critically. Now I would like to ask you a question based on my background is in journalism and media, and so that was my what I felt was the most compelling in your paper is your points about the media. Could you talk about a little bit about the fourth estate and what that means, and what did you learn about the importance of ethical journalism and the constitutional guarantee of a free press in America?
So I briefly went to that concept of the fourth estate. It is pretty much, essentially the press is what the fourth estate is. Freedom of press, the Constitution supports that, that the press should present both sides. And now in today's, especially in main news, it's mainly focused on one side. It's very one-sided, and the freedom to state your opinion, to state the other side is kind of going away. And especially in media and social media, because of cancel culture and misinformation and silencing people who have different opinions on the matter. And the importance of that is that it is backed up by the founding principles of our government, and it should be protected.
I just want to say congratulations, well done on a brilliant paper, well laid out, well logically supported. This is also something that there is no historical research on this one, so finding information and being able to sift through information was very challenging, I'm sure. Just because you could find a lot on one side, but based on the premises, maybe not as much on the other side. So well done on that. And just the fact that it's such recent memory that everyone has memories and everyone has stories about these experiences where we as a culture had to basically strictly adhere to the rules that we made up on the fly to put it in the shortest form I can. So as you began this research, two questions, part one and part two. What was your overall premise as you began? What is it that you're trying to find and document and be able to communicate with everybody today?
So my main premise, I wanted an overview of kind of the whole issue. So I didn't necessarily just want to talk about media. I didn't necessarily want to talk about vaccines or what the healthcare professionals said. I wanted an overview of the whole thing and just briefly go into each and every topic. That's kind of what I wanted from day one. I wanted an overview of the whole thing. And I feel like with an overview, I encourage people to go seek out more into each of those topics. So my whole point of my paper is to, like, when you stop reading my media point, is to say, hey, I want to go explore this more. And after you stop reading my vaccine point, is to say, hey, I want to go explore this more. And the same with my healthcare professionals. And so that was kind of the whole point of my paper, is to give an overview of the whole thing rather than just focus on one topic.
Something I learned through your paper is more about how vaccines are developed and the differences in the new mRNA vaccine. Could you go into what makes that technology different and what potential benefits it offers and why we would pursue that?
So according to what the CDC says on their website, this is all pretty much from the government themselves and from Pfizer, it is essentially the mRNA vaccine. It pretty much gives genetic code on how to protect from a virus, rather than traditional vaccines would have a dead or inactive portion of the virus into your arm. So this one's just trying to give you the genetic code in order that your body will be able to fight it off, and basically use that information. They use that in the messenger Yes. And so that's how they use and point the, basically it teaches the cells how to fight off the virus. That's what the mRNA vaccine does. The traditional ones would just give you an inactive one of the actual virus, and then your body would see the virus and try to fight it off. That's the differences mainly. And supposedly the advantages are that it can be developed a lot quicker, because you don't actually have to put an actual virus into people. You can just teach them how to do it. And you can distribute it easier and things like that. But it's still kind of the same result, because you still get side effects from taking the vaccine like you would with traditional. But that is some of the pros of the vaccine.
So if I can piggyback right off that right there. So what are the benefits of that vaccine as it relates to the COVID-19 virus in the short term? I know you had a lot of statistics and some information on that. Going to share that with us. What does the vaccine do for the virus in the short term, and then what does that do also in the long term?
So the goal of the vaccine was that it would protect you from getting COVID, obviously, but the short-term effects, it's kind of interesting because the CDC says that side effects from the COVID vaccine are common. Very extreme cases, what they say, of really severe reactions, they say are very rare. The research I found outside of the government says that that's not as rare as they think it is. But basically, yeah, like, it's trying to prevent you from getting COVID, and the short-term effects of it is you're still going to get a reaction from taking the shot. The long-term effects of it is very interesting, because there's not really a lot of studies out there on the long-term effects. Just because it is a new technology, so in a way they don't really know what's going to happen in 10 years, 15 years from taking this vaccine.